So it was 68 years ago today that Elvis released his first album. And looking back at it, someone who's, let's say, again, 1920 in that Gen Z category, they might see Elvis as someone whose music is very old fashioned, albeit very fun, because so long as you could dance to it, music never truly goes out of fashion. But what did it represent from a musical point of view? What was so unique about what Elvis put to record on that day in 1956? Well, it's more than meets the eye, and in other ways, it's less than meets the eye. And I'll explain what I mean by that. On the one hand, one of the most striking things about Elvis, and it was true for the entirety of his career, was just how unrevolutionary he was. Elvis was basically in the mold of your traditional classic pop singer, your Bing Crosby's, your Frank Sinatra's, your Dean Martin's. In other words, people with a very good and a very memorable singing voice. And part of that memory at the time meant that it could cut through the static, the low resolution, if you will, of AM radio and have an impact. All of those singers I mentioned had that. Elvis had that, but he was a genuinely, objectively very good singer in addition to being very unique. And he was definitely cut in that mold. He wasn't a songwriter, he wasn't an arranger, he was someone that went into the studio with excellent songs in his bag, if you will, and he recorded his unique take on it with unique arrangements that were crafted by the musicians around him. So, in that sense, Elvis wasn't reinventing the wheel. He was doing what all of the successful male or female pop singers did of the time. But of course, Elvis was revolutionary. And so, to understand that, we have to look at the other musical elements of what Elvis created. So, what was different then than the Bings and the Franks was that he had a very different set of musicians around him. The traditional model for your classic pop singer in that Sinatra mold was either being backed by a big band or by a string orchestra or by a jazz combo or increasingly commonly by a combination of a string orchestra and a big band. So you have a very lush and full sound, which sounded beautiful in the very new stereo equipment of the late 50s. And when you reduced it to mono and put it out on AM radio, it still had a nice cohesive sound that could cut through the low resolution of AM broadcasting at the time. Elvis had a very different set of musicians around him. He had guitars, pianos, a drum set, and certainly in his early days, and particularly on his first few albums, he had a string bass, an upright bass, a contrabasso, as opposed to an electric bass, otherwise known as a bass guitar. Now, this was an early rock and roll setup, and it also borrowed a great deal from country music. Rock and roll itself was really more of a commercial term in the early days than a stylistical term because there was already an existing term which denoted that broad style of music, and that was rhythm and blues, R&B. Why I say, therefore, that rock and roll was more of a marketing decision is if it was black music created by mostly black owned record labels or record labels catering to majority black audiences and marketing it to them, it would be in the R&B section and sold in stores in parts of the country and parts of the world, but generally we're talking America here, that liked R&B music. When that same kind of music was then to be marketed to a mass audience, so white, black, brown, yellow, everyone in between, and perhaps more importantly, international audiences, audiences outside of North America, ta-da, we have rock and roll. There are some sort of minutial musical differences that we can point to. Most rock and roll songs in the early days tended to be quite upbeat, but later on there were rock and roll ballads just as there were R&B ballads. So hence we have this difference, different kinds of musicians around him who were borrowed from the kind of musical palette, the kind of instruments that would be necessary for arrangements in the R&B world and of course the country world as well. And Elvis had a foot in both camps, which is what made him unique. Country music of the time in Tennessee, where Elvis lived, was an almost exclusively white art form. R&B was an almost exclusively black art form, and Elvis borrowed a bit of both. He also, however, recorded songs by people like Rodgers and Hart on the first album. Those, of course, were great songwriters who wrote for just about every occasion, and their music was recorded by just about every major pop star at the time. So, from a compositional standpoint, it was a mix of your classic pop songwriters, your early rock and roll songwriters, your R&B songwriters, and when you put it all together, you get the collection of songs, many of which were very popular on Elvis's smashing debut record. So the other element of Elvis that we have to talk about when trying to understand what made his music so poignant and so interesting to people at the time was the audience that it was aimed to. Now, Elvis intentionally, or at least the people who packaged the album, they were marketing it to young people. So even though it had this same general format as a Bing Crosby record or as a Frank Sinatra record of the time, the musicians on it indicated, they signaled to the audience that this was going to be something different. And so the question therefore arises, what is Elvis most known for? Should he be known for doing the same thing as others, but doing it really, really well? Or should he be known for allowing the rock and roll sound, or should I say the R&B sound, to become pop music? I think it's really a bit of both, even though I lean a bit more towards the first side of that category. And here's why. Pop music, in the classic pop sense, doesn't require originality. Not everything requires originality to be good, and not everything that's good needs to be original. With that pop music format, as you can see, people, Dean Martin, Andy Williams, Perry Como, Bing Crosby, so many, Neil Sedaka later on, so many, they recorded many of the same songs, often only a few years apart. You'd have examples of classic pop singers recording the same songs on the same year. And so originality wasn't the aim. The aim was to do something that was good. The aim was quality, and the originality that was there came from the arrangement of the instruments, the instrumental arrangement backing the singer, and of course, the singer's own unique take, his or her own unique style that they put into that. And Elvis accomplished that brilliantly because he took that format and he ran with it, not just in the mid 50s when his first albums came out, but through all of his life. And I think that in many ways, you could say that Elvis Presley was one of the last great pop singers in that classic pop vein, just as much as it's true to say that he was the first performer to take this nascent rock and roll genre and break it into the mainstream. And I think that we forget that a lot because classic pop music is one of the least controversial of all genres, even compared to country and western, which sometimes had very sort of hardcore themes about love and loss. Classic pop was a genre that everyone could agree was listenable, was acceptable, and because of the high qualities of production, it gave a feel of sophistication. Even if some of the songs were simple, other songs were, of course, very, very complicated. And because of that simplicity, not simplicity, but rather this non controversial nature of that classic pop music, people tend to forget the simple genius of Elvis, and instead they focus on the revolutionary aspects. Why? Because it's more interesting to talk about. There are questions of, well, in this country western R&B hybrid, was it appropriating culture? Was it a thievery of culture? And this was a theme that became very common in the very late 80s and early 90s, particularly in the genre of hip hop. In Fight the Power, Public Enemy dissed Elvis for this reason, that he was essentially thieving from Black artistic culture. A few years later, in 1992, Ice Cube and the Lynch Mob wrote the song You and Your Heroes, which was all about not just Elvis, but about all sorts of white artists of stage and screen and elsewhere from the mid century, and how they don't, and and how the Black community, Black America, shouldn't really be giving them the kind of deference that mainstream America at that time had. And then, of course, around the same time, 1990, you have the Black progressive rock band, progressive funk, some would say, Living Color, and they did Elvis is Dead. So Elvis came in for a lot of criticism at that time, late 80s, early 90s, because of the sociological implications of his fusion music. Because any type of music that fuses things together very consciously and very apparently is going to have those accusations. Dvorak obviously stealing from a bit of Beethoven in Dvorak's Ninth Symphony. And so it's a tale as old as time. John McLaughlin obviously said that all forms of music are ultimately fusion, but when it's really conscious and when it's really obvious to a listener that musical genres that were previously segregated are being fused, there's always going to be some controversial elements there. And all of that exists in Elvis. But the reason that he remained so popular, even after his death, was again back to this first classic pop take on Elvis. He was good. What he did was stand in front of the microphone, sing other people's songs with good arrangements and good production behind him, and he did it really well. So, what should you take away from this video? Well, Elvis was one part revolutionary because his sound was different than anything in the pop world before, but he was also the same in that he followed a tried and true formula where his originality came purely from his talent, and he had a lot. His voice was absolutely great, even in his later days, which are actually some of my favorite days for Elvis performances and recordings. If you don't believe me, listen to his American trilogy, his performances from the 70s of that, and also listen to him do the song made famous by the Righteous Brothers, Unchained Melody. I dare you not to cry hearing an Elvis at the end of his life sing that and sing it absolutely beautifully in spite of his failing health at the time. Thanks again. Remember to like and subscribe, and we will see you next time.